They thought throwing her out would end the night, but they had no idea who was already watching. The chandelier light shimmered across crystal glasses and polished marble floors, casting a golden glow over the grand ballroom of the Romano estate, where wealth didn't just whisper. It announced itself in every tailored suit, every diamond necklace, every measured laugh that echoed just a little too loudly. Amara Hayes kept her eyes down as she moved between tables, her steps quiet against the imported Italian tiles, her hands steady despite the tension tightening her chest, because invisibility wasn't just part of the job, it was survival. And for the past 3 weeks, she had mastered it, memorizing who liked their drinks refilled without asking, who demanded eye contact, who preferred silence, learning the rhythm of a world that was never meant for someone like her, a world where her dark skin and simple uniform marked her as background, as unnoticed, as expendable. But tonight felt different, heavier, like the air itself carried a warning she couldn't quite name, and she felt it in the way conversations dipped when she passed too close, in the way Vanessa Laurent's sharp eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary, in the way a group of guests near the center of the room whispered behind lifted champagne flutes, their glances flickering toward her with quiet amusement. Amara adjusted the tray in her hands, balancing 3 glasses with practiced precision, reminding herself that she was here for a paycheck, for rent that was already 2 weeks overdue, for a life that didn't leave room for mistakes, and especially not here. Not in a mansion that stretched over 12,000 square feet and belonged to a man whose name carried weight far beyond these walls. Victor Romano wasn't supposed to be present tonight. That much she knew. The staff had repeated it all afternoon like a reassurance, like a shield. Mister Romano is out of town. Mister Romano won't return until tomorrow, but even in his absence, his presence lingered in the rigid posture of the security at every doorway, in the hushed tone of the guests when his name surfaced in conversation, in the quiet understanding that everything here still belonged to him. Amara exhaled slowly as she approached the long dining table near the windows, the city lights stretching beyond the glass like a distant constellation. And she placed the drinks carefully in front of the guests, offering a polite nod without speaking, because speaking invited attention, and attention could turn in an instant, as she had learned long before she ever stepped into this house. "Hey," a voice called out suddenly, sharp enough to cut through the music, and Amara froze for half a second before turning, her heart skipping as she found Vanessa Laurent standing a few feet away, elegant in a silver gown that shimmered with every movement, her posture flawless, her smile precise but cold. The kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Come here," Vanessa said, her tone casual, but the command beneath it unmistakable, and the room seemed to shift, conversations slowing, heads turning just enough to notice without appearing obvious, the subtle gravity of power drawing attention like a silent storm. Amara stepped forward carefully, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of her tray, every instinct urging her to remain calm, to stay small, to not give anyone a reason to look twice. "Yes, Mom," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pulse beating louder in her ears. Vanessa tilted her head, studying her as if examining something out of place, something that didn't quite belong. And for a moment, the room felt smaller, the laughter quieter, the music distant, as if everything had narrowed down to this single interaction. "That necklace," Vanessa said, her voice light but edged with something sharper, her hand lifting to touch the empty space at her collarbone. It was right here a minute ago, and a ripple moved through the nearby guests, subtle but undeniable, curiosity sparking behind polite expressions. Amara blinked, confusion flickering across her face before she could stop it. and she shook her head slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I haven't seen," but she didn't get to finish because Vanessa's smile widened just enough to feel dangerous, her eyes locking onto Amara's with quiet certainty. "Really?" she said softly, and the word carried further than it should have, drawing more attention, more eyes, more silent judgment. Amara felt it then, the shift, the moment when the room stopped seeing her as invisible and started seeing her as something else entirely, something to question, something to suspect, and her grip tightened on the tray as her breath caught in her chest, because she knew this feeling, knew this moment, the fragile edge where dignity could be taken in a heartbeat. "Check her," someone murmured from behind Vanessa. Not loud, but loud enough. And a few guests exchanged glances, their expressions carefully neutral, but their interest unmistakable, as if this were entertainment, as if this were part of the evening. Amara's pulse pounded in her ears as she looked from one face to another, searching for something understanding, doubt, anything but finding none, only polite distance and quiet expectation. And in that moment, she realized something far more unsettling than the accusation itself, something colder, something heavier. No one here was waiting for the truth. They were waiting for confirmation. The silence stretched just long enough to feel intentional, just long enough for every eye in the room to settle on Amara as if she had already been judged. And she could feel it pressing against her skin, heavier than the humid summer air outside the tall glass windows, heavier than the tray she still held in her trembling hands. Vanessa took a slow step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, each sound measured, controlled, deliberate, as though she were performing for an audience that had already decided to applaud. And, in a way, she was, because the room had shifted into something else now, no longer a celebration, but a quiet spectacle. "Put that down," Vanessa said, her tone gentle but firm, the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to be obeyed. And Amara hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering the tray onto the nearest table, her movements careful, precise, as if any sudden motion might confirm something she did not do. "I think it would be best if we made sure nothing has been misplaced," Vanessa continued, her smile still perfectly composed, but there was a sharpness beneath it now, something colder, something that did not invite disagreement. Amara swallowed, her throat dry, her voice barely above a whisper as she said, "I did not take anything." And the words felt small the moment they left her mouth, fragile against the weight of the room, against the quiet murmur that followed, because denial did not carry power here, not in a place where appearances meant everything, and hers had already placed her on the wrong side of the line. One of the guests, a man in a navy suit with a gold watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if this were an inconvenience rather than a moment that could change someone's life. "It is always the same story," he said under his breath, but loud enough to be heard, and a few others nodded subtly, their expressions polite but dismissive, as if they had seen this before, as if they had already reached their conclusions long before tonight. Amara felt her chest tighten, not from anger, but from something deeper, something quieter, the familiar weight of being seen without being known, of being reduced to an assumption that did not require proof. And she forced herself to keep her shoulders straight, to keep her hands still at her sides, because dignity, she had learned, was not something you were given. It was something you held onto, even when everything around you tried to take it. Vanessa's gaze never left her as she gestured slightly toward one of the staff members standing near the edge of the room, a woman who looked uncertain, caught between instruction and hesitation. "Go ahead," Vanessa said softly. We just need to be sure. And the staff member stepped forward slowly, her eyes flickering toward Amara with something that almost resembled apology. But not enough to stop what was about to happen. Amara shook her head once, a small movement, but deliberate. "Please," she said, her voice steadier now, surprising even herself. "There is no reason for this." And for a brief moment, something shifted in the air. A pause, a hesitation, as if the room itself considered the possibility that she might be telling the truth. But it was fleeting, gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the quiet expectation that had already taken hold. "There is every reason," Vanessa replied, her tone cooling slightly, the warmth in her smile fading just enough to reveal the steel beneath it. "When something valuable goes missing, we do not take chances." And with that, she turned her attention back to the others, as if the decision had already been made, as if Amara were no longer a person in the room but a problem to be handled. The staff member reached out, hesitating only for a second before lightly checking the pockets of Amara's uniform. The fabric worn but clean, the seams pressed carefully that morning, and the room watched, not openly, not rudely, but with a subtle intensity that made it impossible to ignore, like a collective breath being held. Amara closed her eyes briefly, just for a moment, not in fear, but in restraint, in the effort it took to remain still, to not let the humiliation rise to the surface, to not let her voice break, because she knew that once it did, once emotion slipped through, it would only confirm what they already believed. The staff member stepped back, shaking her head slightly. "There is nothing," she said quietly. And for a second, a flicker of uncertainty crossed a few faces in the crowd, a ripple that threatened to disrupt the narrative that had formed so quickly. But Vanessa did not hesitate, did not falter. Instead, she let out a soft, almost amused breath. "Then she must have hidden it somewhere else," she said, her voice light again, as if this were all part of a simple process. As if the absence of evidence was merely a delay, not a contradiction. Amara opened her eyes, her gaze steady now, meeting Vanessa's for the first time. And there was something different in that look, not defiance, not anger, but a quiet clarity, a refusal to shrink any further. And it was subtle, so subtle that most of the room did not notice. But Vanessa did, and for a fraction of a second, her expression tightened, just enough to reveal that this was no longer as effortless as she had expected. "You can leave," Vanessa said finally, her voice carrying across the room with quiet authority, and the words landed heavier than anything else that had been said, because they were not a suggestion, not a request, but a dismissal, a removal, a way of restoring order by erasing the disruption entirely. Amara did not move right away, not because she was refusing, but because she understood what that meant, that stepping out of this room would not just end the moment, it would define it, seal it, turn it into something that would follow her long after tonight. And yet, she nodded slowly, because there was no space here to argue, no room to be heard. She turned toward the tall doors at the far end of the ballroom, her steps measured, her back straight, and as she walked, the quiet murmur resumed behind her, conversations picking up as if nothing significant had happened, as if the night could simply continue. But just before she reached the exit, a low voice near the window cut through the noise, barely audible, almost lost beneath the music. "Strange," someone said, thoughtful, uncertain. "Mr. Romano does not like unfinished stories," and though no one responded, the words lingered, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. The doors closed behind her with a soft, almost polite click, but the sound echoed louder in Amara's chest than anything that had happened inside the ballroom, as if that single moment had sealed something she could not yet name. And for a few seconds, she simply stood there in the quiet hallway, the distant music muffled by thick walls, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface of a nearby mirror, a reminder of exactly how out of place she looked in a world built on perfection and control. Her hands trembled, just slightly now, not from fear, but from the effort it took to hold everything in, to keep her breathing steady, to keep her shoulders from collapsing under the weight of what had just happened, because humiliation was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, measured, wrapped in politeness and soft voices that carried more judgment than any raised tone ever could. She inhaled slowly, counting the seconds the way her grandmother had taught her when life felt too heavy to carry. 1, 2, 3. Letting the air fill her lungs before releasing it just as carefully. Grounding herself in something real, something that could not be taken from her. Outside, beyond the tall glass doors at the end of the hallway. The night stretched wide and humid, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement from a brief summer rain that had passed unnoticed during the party. And Amara moved toward it, each step steady, deliberate, as if walking away from something invisible but undeniable. The moment she stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler against her skin, carrying the faint scent of rain and asphalt, a sharp contrast to the controlled luxury inside. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself to close her eyes for a second, just one, letting the silence settle around her. Because out here, there were no watching eyes, no quiet judgments, no expectations she could not meet. A soft sound pulled her attention back, a small whimper, almost lost beneath the distant hum of traffic, and she turned slightly, her gaze falling toward the edge of the driveway where a young boy stood beneath the overhang, no older than 7 or 8, dressed in clothes that were clearly too formal for his age, his small hands gripping the railing as he looked out at the rain with uncertain eyes. Amara hesitated, her instinct telling her to keep moving, to leave, to not involve herself in anything that might draw her back into the orbit of that house. But something in the boy's posture, in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure and quiet, made her pause. She stepped closer, slowly, careful not to startle him, her voice gentle when she spoke. "Hey, are you okay?" And the boy looked up at her, his expression a mix of curiosity and something softer, something that mirrored the unease she had felt inside. "It is too loud in there," he said simply, his voice small but clear. And Amara nodded, understanding more than he realized. "Yeah," she replied softly. "Sometimes it is." And for a moment, neither of them spoke, just stood there listening to the faint rhythm of water dripping from the roof, the world outside moving at its own pace, unaffected by the drama inside those walls. The boy glanced back toward the doors, then back at her. "They said you were in trouble," he added, not accusing, not judgmental, just repeating what he had heard. And Amara felt something tighten in her chest again, but this time it was different, less sharp, more grounded, and she offered a small smile, one that did not quite reach her eyes but was honest all the same. "Sometimes people say things they do not understand," she said quietly, and the boy considered that, his brow furrowing slightly as if trying to make sense of it. A sudden breeze swept through the driveway, carrying a light drizzle with it. And without thinking, Amara stepped forward, shifting slightly to block the wind from reaching him, her hand resting lightly against the railing as she angled her body to shield him from the rain. A small, instinctive gesture that required no thought, no calculation, just something that felt natural. The boy looked up at her again, noticing the movement, and for the first time, a faint smile appeared on his face, subtle but genuine. "Thank you," he said, and Amara nodded, her gaze softening as she looked down at him. "You are welcome," she replied. And in that quiet moment, something shifted, not in the world around them, not in the mansion behind them, but in the space between two people who had no reason to trust each other but did anyway. Inside, the music continued, the laughter resumed, the illusion of normalcy restored, but beyond the glass doors, unnoticed by most, a security camera mounted high above the entrance captured everything. The angle wide enough to include the empty driveway, the soft glow of the exterior lights, and the small figure of a maid standing in the rain, shielding a child who was not her responsibility and far from the estate, miles away on a darkened highway. A black car moved steadily through the night, its interior quiet except for the faint hum of the engine, and on a screen embedded in the dashboard, a live feed played silently, the image clear, precise, showing exactly what had been missed inside. And the man watching it did not speak, did not react immediately, but his eyes, sharp and unreadable, did not move away from the screen, not even for a second. The car did not slow down until the gates of the estate came into view. Tall iron bars illuminated by soft ground lights that stretched across the driveway like silent guards, and inside the vehicle, the screen continued to glow with the same frozen image. Amara standing beneath the overhang, her posture steady, her body angled just enough to shield the boy from the rain. A moment so simple it could have been ignored, yet impossible to dismiss once seen. Victor Romano's fingers rested lightly against the edge of the console, unmoving. His gaze fixed on the screen with a focus that did not waver. Not when the car turned, not when the headlights swept across the stone walls of his property, not even when the driver spoke quietly from the front seat. "We are here, sir," because the words barely registered, drowned out by something far more significant than a delayed arrival or a crowded party waiting behind those doors. He had watched the earlier footage as well, every second of it. The way the room had shifted, the way voices had lowered but judgment had sharpened, the way Vanessa had controlled the narrative with effortless precision, and most of all, the way Amara had stood there, not raising her voice, not pleading beyond what dignity allowed, holding herself together in a space designed to break that kind of restraint. And it was not the accusation that held his attention now, nor the missing necklace, but the contrast, the quiet, undeniable difference between what had been assumed and what had been shown. The car came to a complete stop, and for a moment, nothing happened. The engine idling softly as the guards at the gate straightened, already aware of who sat inside, their movements quick but controlled as they prepared to open the entrance. And still, Victor did not move, his eyes lingering on the screen as if committing every detail to memory. The angle of her shoulders, the way she had stepped forward without hesitation to shield someone else. The absence of hesitation where most would have turned away. And then, finally, he reached forward and turned the screen off. The sudden darkness in its place felt heavier than the image itself, as if what had been seen could not simply disappear with the press of a button. "Open it," he said, his voice low, even, carrying no hint of urgency, yet the effect was immediate. The gates sliding apart with mechanical precision, revealing the long driveway lined with trimmed hedges and carefully placed lights that guided the way back to the house, where music still filtered faintly into the night. Inside, the party had resumed its rhythm. The earlier tension softened into polite conversation, laughter carefully measured, glasses refilled as if the interruption had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And Vanessa stood near the center of the room, her posture flawless, her expression composed, speaking to a group of guests with the same effortless charm that had defined the evening. Her voice smooth, controlled, as though she had already rewritten the narrative into something acceptable, something forgettable. "It was simply a misunderstanding," she said lightly, lifting her glass just enough to punctuate the sentence. "These things happen." And the guests around her nodded in quiet agreement, their smiles returning, their attention shifting back to the comfort of familiarity. Because it was easier that way, easier to accept a version of events that required no discomfort, no reconsideration, no accountability near the edge of the room. One of the staff members who had been present earlier stood still for a moment longer than necessary, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes briefly flickering toward the entrance before she forced her attention back to her duties, as if pushing away a thought she could not afford to follow. Outside. The front doors opened with a controlled ease, and the subtle shift in the air was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable, like a change in pressure before a storm. Conversations dipping just enough to signal awareness, heads turning in quiet synchronization as Victor Romano stepped inside, his presence altering the room without a single word spoken, his dark suit untouched by the rain, his expression unreadable, the kind of stillness that carried its own authority. He did not look at Vanessa first, did not acknowledge the guests who straightened at his arrival. Instead, his gaze moved slowly across the room, taking in every detail with a calm precision that left no space for uncertainty. And though no one spoke, the shift was complete now, the earlier confidence replaced by something else, something quieter, something waiting. Vanessa's smile held for a fraction longer before she turned towards him, her posture unchanged, her voice warm as she stepped forward. "You are back earlier than expected," she said, her tone smooth, practiced, but there was a flicker beneath it now. Something less certain, something that had not been there before. Victor stopped a few feet away, his eyes finally settling on her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to unsettle, to remind everyone in the room that this was no longer a story they could control, no longer a moment that could be smoothed over with polite words. And then, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, he asked a single question that did not need to be repeated. "Where is she?" For a moment, no one answered, and the silence that followed his question did not feel empty. It felt heavy, as if the entire room had been forced to hold its breath at once, unsure of what came next or who would dare to speak first. Vanessa's smile remained in place, but it no longer carried the same effortless confidence, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass before she set it down with controlled precision, her posture still flawless, her voice still smooth when she finally responded. "I am not sure who you are referring to," she said lightly, as though the question itself were unclear, as though the evening had not already drawn a line between truth and convenience. Victor did not react immediately, did not repeat himself, did not raise his voice, and that absence of urgency unsettled the room more than any display of anger could have, because it suggested something else entirely, something colder, something already decided. His gaze remained steady, fixed on Vanessa with quiet intensity, and when he spoke again, his tone did not change. "The maid," he said simply, each word measured, leaving no space for misinterpretation. A faint ripple moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable, as if the earlier moment they had so easily dismissed had returned, no longer distant, no longer forgettable, but standing in the center of the room once again, demanding acknowledgement. Vanessa tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting just enough to suggest mild concern rather than control. "There was a small issue earlier," she replied, her voice calm, composed. "It has already been handled." And she gestured vaguely toward the entrance, as if that explanation were sufficient, as if the matter were beneath further discussion. Victor's eyes did not follow her gesture, did not move away from her face, and for a brief second, something unreadable passed through his expression, not anger, not disbelief, but something closer to recognition, as if he were confirming what he had already seen. "Handled," he repeated, the word quiet, almost neutral. But it landed differently now, stripped of comfort, carrying a weight that made several guests shift slightly where they stood. Across the room, the staff member who had earlier checked Amara's uniform lowered her gaze, her shoulders stiffening as if she could feel the direction of the conversation even without being directly addressed. Vanessa let out a soft breath, her smile returning just enough to smooth the tension. She was asked to leave, she clarified, her tone still measured. It was necessary under the circumstances, and she lifted her chin slightly, as though reinforcing the authority behind her decision, as though expecting agreement, or at the very least, acceptance. Victor's silence stretched again, longer this time, long enough for the faint music in the background to become noticeable once more. Long enough for the room to begin to understand that this was not a conversation being had for explanation, but for something else entirely. He turned his head slightly then, his gaze shifting past Vanessa, moving across the room with deliberate precision until it landed on one of the security personnel stationed near the entrance, a man who immediately straightened under the weight of that attention. "Did you escort her out?" Victor asked, his voice calm, direct. The guard hesitated for the briefest moment before answering. "Yes, sir," his tone respectful, controlled, but there was a subtle tightness beneath it, the kind that comes from knowing that the answer may not be enough. Victor nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and then asked, "Was anything found?" And this time, the hesitation was more visible, the guard's eyes flickering briefly before he responded. "No, sir." And the word seemed to echo more loudly than it should have, cutting through the quiet with a clarity that no one could ignore. A murmur passed through the guests, softer than before, less certain, the earlier confidence beginning to fracture as the pieces of the narrative no longer aligned as neatly as they had moments ago. Vanessa's posture remained unchanged, but her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. "That does not mean anything," she said quickly, her tone still controlled, though the edge beneath it was now more apparent. She could have hidden it elsewhere, and the explanation hung in the air, thinner than before, less convincing now that it had to stand against something more solid than assumption. Victor looked at her again, his expression unreadable, and for a second, it seemed as though he might respond, might challenge the statement directly, but instead, he did something else entirely, something quieter, something far more unsettling. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small device, no larger than his palm. It screened dark until he tapped it once, and when the image appeared, it cast a faint glow against his hand, subtle but unmistakable, drawing the attention of those closest to him without a single word spoken. He did not hold it up for the room to see, did not announce what it contained. He simply looked at it for a moment, as if confirming something only he needed to understand. And then he lifted his gaze back to Vanessa, the silence returning, deeper now, heavier, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by speculation, but by something far more definitive. And in that stillness, the illusion that had held the evening together began to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for everyone present to feel it, to sense that the story they had accepted so easily was no longer in their control. Victor did not rush the moment, did not lift the device for the room to see, and that restraint alone made every second stretch longer than it should have, because anticipation carried its own weight, and in that silence, every person present felt it pressing against them, forcing them to reconsider what they thought they understood. Vanessa's eyes flickered briefly toward the device in his hand, just for a fraction of a second, before she steadied herself, her posture straightening, her expression smoothing into something composed, something practiced. "If there is something you would like to say," she began, her tone measured, almost inviting, "you can say it openly." But the invitation did not sound like confidence anymore. It sounded like control trying to reassert itself. Victor's gaze remained steady, not on the screen, not on the guests, but on her. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost quiet. "I prefer to show," he said. And the simplicity of the sentence shifted something in the room, subtle but undeniable, because showing required no argument, no persuasion, only truth. He turned the device slightly, angling it just enough for Vanessa to see, and though the others could not make out the details, they could see her reaction, the smallest change in her expression, the faint tightening around her eyes, the way her shoulders held just a little too still, as if resisting the instinct to move. The screen reflected a moment frozen in time. The exterior of the house, the dim glow of the driveway lights, the rain still falling in thin, steady lines. And there, unmistakable, was Amara, standing just outside the doors, her posture calm, her body angled protectively in front of the young boy, shielding him from the wind and the rain without hesitation, without any awareness that she was being watched. The image did not accuse, did not explain, but it revealed something far more powerful than either. A contradiction so clear it required no words. Vanessa blinked once, slowly, her gaze fixed on the screen for just a moment too long before she looked away, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. "And this proves, well, exactly," she said, her voice steady, though the edge beneath it was now unmistakable, sharper than before. Victor lowered the device slightly, his eyes never leaving her. "It proves timing," he replied, his tone even. "It proves where she was." And the words settled into the room with quiet precision, dismantling the assumption that had been built earlier piece by piece. A murmur moved through the guests again, softer now, more uncertain, their earlier confidence replaced by something closer to hesitation, as if they were beginning to understand that they had accepted a story too quickly, too easily. Vanessa exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing lightly against the side of her dress as if grounding herself. "That does not exclude the possibility," she said, her tone controlled, but now carrying a trace of insistence. She could have taken it earlier, and the explanations sounded thinner this time, less certain, as if it were being constructed in real time rather than drawn from something solid. Victor tilted his head slightly, considering her words, not dismissing them, not challenging them directly, but allowing the weight of what had already been shown to settle around them. "Then, we should be thorough," he said. And there was something in the way he spoke, something measured and deliberate, that made it clear this was no longer a suggestion, but a direction. He turned then, his attention shifting away from Vanessa for the first time since he had entered, his gaze moving toward the staff, toward the edges of the room where those who had been present earlier stood in quiet observation. "Bring the footage from inside," he said calmly, and the request, simple as it was, carried a finality that changed everything. Because it meant the story would not end with assumption. It would continue until there was nothing left to question. The staff member nearest the control panel hesitated for a brief moment before nodding, her hands moving quickly as she made her way toward the system that controlled the cameras. her movements precise but slightly hurried, as if she understood the significance of what was being asked. The room remained silent as the screen near the far wall flickered to life, the soft glow illuminating the faces of those closest to it, drawing their attention without needing to demand it. And one by one, the earlier moments began to play. The arrival of guests, the movement of staff, the subtle interactions that had gone unnoticed at the time but now carried new meaning. Victor stood still, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable, but there was a focus in his eyes that had not been there before, a quiet intensity that suggested this was not about a necklace, not about a single accusation, but about something deeper, something that could not be ignored once it had been revealed. And as the footage continued, as the room watched in silence, the narrative that had once seemed so certain began to unravel, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with clarity, each second adding weight to a truth that had been overlooked, until finally, the space between assumption and reality became impossible to ignore, and in that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, leaving only one question that no one had yet answered, but everyone now understood would have to be. The footage continued to roll in silence, each second stretching longer than it should have. The soft hum of the system, the only sound filling the space where laughter had once lived, and one by one, the small details began to surface, not dramatic, not obvious, but undeniable in their quiet precision. The camera angle shifted to the moment just before the accusation, capturing Vanessa near the center of the room, her posture elegant, her movements fluid, but now, under the still gaze of the screen, something else became visible, something that had gone unnoticed before. The brief second where her hand moved to her necklace, unclasping it with practiced ease, her expression unchanged as she turned slightly, positioning herself just out of direct view of most guests, except for the camera that missed nothing. A faint ripple moved through the room, subtle but unmistakable, as eyes began to follow the sequence, as understanding slowly replaced assumption, and no one spoke. Because no one needed to, not yet. The footage did not rush, did not skip ahead. It simply showed. And in showing, it revealed the truth without needing to declare it. Vanessa's hand, now holding the necklace, lowered casually to her side, her fingers closing around it before slipping it smoothly into the fold of her dress. A movement so controlled, so deliberate, that it would have been invisible in real time, lost in the noise of conversation and the distraction of the evening. But here, on the screen, slowed by attention, it was clear, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Someone near the back of the room shifted, the soft sound of a shoe against marble breaking the silence for just a moment before stillness returned. Heavier now, pressing down on every person present. Vanessa did not move at first, her eyes fixed on the screen, her expression carefully held, but the stillness around her was no longer protective. It was isolating, drawing attention rather than deflecting it. And for the first time that evening, she stood alone in the center of the room, not as a host, not as a figure of control, but as the subject of the very scrutiny she had directed elsewhere. Victor remained where he stood, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, not on the screen, but on her, as if the footage were not for him, as if he had already seen enough, already understood what it revealed. The video moved forward, showing the moment Vanessa turned back toward the group, her smile intact, her voice unheard, but her intention now visible. And then the next sequence, the accusation, the shift in attention, the way the room had followed her lead without question, without hesitation. And finally, the removal, the quiet dismissal that had seemed so justified only minutes before. The screen went still, the final frame frozen in place. Vanessa standing exactly where she was now. Her image reflected back at her from across the room, a silent mirror of what had been done. No one spoke. No one moved, and the silence that followed was complete. Not fragile, not uncertain, but absolute. The kind that did not ask for explanation because it had already received it. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if she were about to say something, to reshape the moment, to reclaim control. But no words came, not immediately, because there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to adjust, only the reality of what had been seen, what had been witnessed by everyone in the room. Victor finally shifted his gaze then, not away, but closer, stepping forward just enough to close the distance between them, his presence quiet but commanding, his voice calm when he spoke. "You asked for certainty," he said, and the simplicity of the sentence carried more weight than any accusation could have, because it did not condemn, it did not accuse, it simply acknowledged what was already undeniable. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her composure still intact, but no longer seamless, the edges now visible, the effort now apparent. "This does not change anything," she said, her voice steady. Though the certainty within it had begun to fracture, it was a misunderstanding, but the words felt different now, thinner, less convincing, as if they had lost their foundation the moment the truth had been shown. A quiet murmur moved through the guests again, not in agreement, not in judgment, but in realization, the collective awareness that they had participated in something they did not fully understand, that they had followed a narrative without question, and now, faced with its unraveling, they could no longer stand where they had before. Victor's expression did not change, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged as he responded. "It changes everything," and the words settled into the room with finality, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, leaving no space for debate, no room for denial. And in that moment, as the weight of the truth settled over them all, the balance of the room shifted completely, the roles reversed, the assumptions dismantled, leaving only one undeniable reality standing in their place, and no one dared to speak against it. No one moved, not even Vanessa, though the entire room seemed to shift away from her without a single step being taken, the space around her widening in a way that could not be measured but could be felt, as if the truth itself had drawn a boundary no one dared to cross. The glow from the screen faded, but its imprint remained, etched into every expression, every lowered gaze, every quiet breath that followed. And for the first time that night, the balance of power was not held by elegance or influence, but by something far simpler and far more difficult to ignore. Victor let the silence settle, did not rush to fill it, did not offer explanations or justifications, because none were needed. The moment had already spoken for itself. Vanessa's composure held, but it was no longer seamless. The effort behind it now visible in the slight tightening of her jaw, the careful control of her breathing, the way her fingers curled slightly at her sides before she forced them still. "You are making a spectacle out of nothing," she said finally, her voice steady, but the words no longer carried authority. They sounded smaller now, contained within the reality that had already been revealed. Victor did not respond to the tone, did not engage with the attempt to redirect. Instead, he turned his attention slightly, his gaze moving across the room once more before settling on the same security guard from earlier. "Bring her back," he said, and the simplicity of the command cut through the space with quiet certainty, leaving no room for hesitation. The guard nodded immediately, his earlier stiffness replaced by a clear sense of direction, and without another word, he moved toward the doors, his footsteps measured but purposeful as he exited the room. A ripple moved through the guests, softer now, less certain. Their earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by something closer to reflection. The realization settling in that they had witnessed not just an accusation, but its unraveling, and that their silence had been part of it. Vanessa turned slightly, her posture still controlled, but her gaze sharper now, focused directly on Victor. "This is unnecessary," she said, her voice lowering just enough to carry a different weight, less for the room, more for him. "You are undermining your own event," but the words felt disconnected from the moment, as if they belonged to a different conversation, one that no longer applied. Victor met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged. "This is my event," he replied calmly, and the distinction was clear, absolute, not raised, not emphasized, but undeniable. The room fell silent again, deeper this time, as the meaning settled in, as the line between control and authority became impossible to ignore. Moments later, the doors opened once more, and the subtle shift in attention followed immediately, heads turning, conversations halting before they could begin as Amara stepped back inside. Her presence was quieter than before, her uniform slightly damp from the rain, her posture still straight, still composed, though the weight of what had happened lingered in the careful way she held herself, in the measured steps that carried her forward without hesitation but without ease. She paused just inside the room, her eyes briefly scanning the space, taking in the faces that had once looked at her with dismissal, now watching her with something entirely different, something uncertain, something that had not been there before. Victor's gaze softened, not visibly, not in a way that could be easily defined, but in the absence of the cold distance that had marked his earlier presence. And when he spoke, his voice remained steady, but there was a clarity to it now, a direction that did not require force. "Come here," he said, and Amara hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping forward, her movements calm, deliberate, her eyes meeting his briefly before lowering again, not out of submission, but out of habit, a learned instinct that had carried her through far more than this night. The room watched, silent, as she came to stand a few feet away, the space between them defined not by distance, but by everything that had unfolded to bring her back inside. Victor turned slightly, his attention shifting just enough to include the room without leaving her behind. "You were accused," he said, his voice even, not loud, but carrying easily through the silence. "And you were removed." And the words did not carry judgment, only fact, only acknowledgement. Amara nodded once, her voice quiet but steady when she responded, "Yes, sir." And there was no bitterness in it, no anger, only the simple truth of what had happened. Victor held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if weighing something beyond the words, something that had been shown rather than said, and then he spoke again. Nothing was found. He continued, and this time the statement carried further, reaching every corner of the room, settling into every person who had witnessed the earlier scene. Amara did not respond immediately, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, because she did not need to defend herself now, did not need to explain. The truth had already been placed where everyone could see it. Victor turned then, his gaze returning to Vanessa, the final piece of the moment falling into place. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, holding within it the weight of everything that had been revealed, everything that could no longer be ignored, and everything that was about to change. Vanessa did not look away this time, even as the weight of the room shifted entirely against her, even as the silence stretched into something heavier than any accusation could have been, because there was nowhere left to redirect it, nowhere left to hide within the comfort of assumption or polished words. Her posture remained upright, her expression controlled, but the effort behind it was no longer invisible. It was present in the slight tension at the corners of her mouth, in the careful way she held her shoulders, as though maintaining composure had become a deliberate act rather than a natural one. "You are overreacting," she said finally, her voice steady, though quieter now, as if the room no longer belonged to her, as if the authority she had carried earlier had slipped just beyond her reach. Victor did not respond immediately, did not interrupt, and that silence once again carried more weight than any argument could have, because it allowed her words to settle exactly as they were, unchallenged but also unsupported, left standing on their own without reinforcement. He turned his gaze fully toward her, his expression unchanged, calm, measured, but there was something else beneath it now, something that had not been present before, not anger, not disappointment, but a clarity that left no space for interpretation. "No," he said quietly, and the single word cut through the room with absolute precision, not loud, not forceful, but final. The stillness that followed was immediate, complete, as if even the air itself had paused to acknowledge the shift. Victor took a slow step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the moment unmistakably direct, unmistakably personal. "I am correcting," he continued, his tone even, each word deliberate, what was done in my absence, and the distinction settled into the room with quiet authority, reframing everything that had happened. Not as an isolated mistake, but as something that required acknowledgement, something that could not simply be dismissed. Vanessa's composure faltered, just slightly, the first visible crack in the control she had maintained all evening. And for a brief moment, her eyes shifted, not to the guests, not to the staff, but to the space between herself and Amara, as if measuring something she had not anticipated needing to consider. Victor turned then, his attention returning to Amara, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same steadiness, but there was a difference now, a subtle shift in tone that did not soften his authority but redirected it. "You were treated without proof," he said, and the words were simple, direct, leaving no room for interpretation. "And you were removed without reason," and the clarity of the statement settled into the space between them, not as a question, not as a judgment, but as an acknowledgement of fact. Amara stood still, her posture composed, her hands resting calmly at her sides. And for a moment, she did not respond, not because she could not, but because she understood what this moment was, what it required, and what it did not. "Yes, sir," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady, and there was no hesitation in it, no need to explain further, because the truth had already been established. Victor held her gaze for a brief moment, and then he did something that no one in the room expected, something that shifted the balance completely. Not through force, not through display, but through something far more deliberate. "Then it is corrected," he said, and the words carried across the room with quiet certainty. Not as a promise, but as a resolution. He turned back to Vanessa, his gaze steady, his expression unchanged. "The necklace," he said calmly, "is still in your possession." And though the statement was simple, its impact was immediate, undeniable, because it removed the final layer of uncertainty, leaving nothing left to question, nothing left to reinterpret. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, her composure holding only through visible effort now. And for the first time, she did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to say that had not already been undone. The room remained silent, every eye fixed on the space between them, every breath measured, waiting, not for conflict, but for conclusion. Victor did not raise his voice, did not demand, did not escalate. He simply waited. And in that waiting, the expectation became unavoidable. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Vanessa's hand moved, her fingers brushing against the fabric of her dress before reaching inward, and when she withdrew it, the diamond necklace caught the light once more, its brilliance unchanged, its presence undeniable, and the room exhaled as one, not in relief, but in recognition. Victor did not react to the gesture, did not acknowledge it beyond the quiet confirmation it provided. Instead, he turned his attention outward, his gaze moving across the room, encompassing everyone who had witnessed the moment, everyone who had been part of it, whether through action or silence. Respect, he said, his voice calm, carrying easily without effort, is not defined by position, and the words settled into the space with a weight that required no emphasis. It is defined by how you treat those who have none, and no one spoke, no one moved, because the truth of it was not something that could be debated, not after what had just been seen. Amara stood where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. But there was something different now, something that did not come from the room, did not come from Victor, but from within, a quiet steadiness that had remained even when everything else had shifted. And now, for the first time that night, it was visible to everyone. Victor looked at her once more, his gaze steady, and then, without another word, he turned away. The decision made, the moment complete, and the room, once filled with quiet judgment, now held only silence, not empty, not uncertain, but absolute, as if something had been restored that could not be undone. And in that stillness, no one dared to look at her the way they had before, because they had already seen what dignity looked like, and they could not pretend otherwise.